Okay. Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Paul, and today I felt, after this recent event in Texas with the mass shooting there, and also after seeing a video from a popular YouTuber giving his account of what happened here in Port Arthur and giving what I thought was a woeful psychological profile of Martin Bryant, I felt motivated and compelled to share some of the research that I'd done on this subject. It is a pretty immense subject, so I'll do the best that I can in a concise sort of manner. There's no way I'm going to be able to touch on everything, but I have some slides and some quotes I'd like to share first. I thought it'd be important to establish a context for what I am going to say later about Port Arthur. So in this video here, that is my main objective. So I'll just share, let me just get these slides up. So, okay. So yeah, that was my little title, the Port Arthur Massacre, mass shootings and gun control legislation, an alternative account. So my intention is to establish a rational context for the Port Arthur Massacre, and I guess for these mass shootings in general, but we're going to focus on Port Arthur, to have an open, honest, and objective consideration of the facts, at least the ones that I will get around to touching on in these videos. Also want to offer an alternative account to the one given officially. And it's also my intention to honor and respect all the innocent lives that were impacted or destroyed by that horrific event. Okay, so also it is not my intention for this to come across in any way as offensive, sensationalistic, or theoretical. I'm not interested in opinions and beliefs or what people think they know because they heard it on the television or something like that. I'm just interested in the events as they occurred over those 2 days. All right. Now, I'd like to sort of zoom out a little bit from these individual and isolated incidences and just touch on this concept. It's a huge concept, but I'm just going to very briefly bring it into the equation of what we're talking about here, and that is the New World Order. And I've got just a couple of quotes I'll share. This first one is from the great G. Edward Griffin and his monumental book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And he says this, quote, "None of this is happening by accident. I've documented the currently unfolding plan to create a functional world government within the framework of the United Nations. Often referred to as the New World Order by its advocates, the proposed global government is designed upon the principles of collectivism." And that's super important, and I'll come back to that. He goes on to say there are 2 mechanisms of power being readied at the United Nations. One is a military command to eventually control all national armies and superweapons. That is being accomplished under the slogans of peace and disarmament, end quote. In the same book, and referring to this document called the Report from Iron Mountain, he says, quote, "We are approaching a point in history where the old formulas may no longer work. Why? Because it may now be possible to create a world government in which all nations will be disarmed and disciplined by a world army, a condition which will be called peace. The report says, the word peace, as we have used it in the following pages, implies total and general disarmament. Under that scenario, independent nations will no longer exist and governments will not have the capability to wage war. There could be military action by the World Army against renegade political subdivisions, but these would be called peacekeeping operations and soldiers would be called peacekeepers. No matter how much property is destroyed or how much blood is spilled, the bullets will be peaceful bullets, and the bombs, even atomic bombs if necessary, will be peaceful bombs, end quote. And, just think about the converse of governments will not have the capability to wage war. They also won't have the capability to defend themselves if the world government that they're putting all of their trust in turns out to be a tyrannical nightmare. Okay. Next, we have Dr. John Coleman, ex-MI6 British intelligence, who wrote prolifically on this topic. And in his book, The Committee of 300, and referring to their priorities, he has this to say, quote, to give the fullest support to supranational institutions such as the United Nations, bring local institutions under the mantle of the United Nations. All laws will be uniform under a legal system of world courts, practicing the same unified code of laws, backed up by a one world government police force and a one world unified military to enforce laws in all former countries where national boundaries shall no longer exist. Privately owned firearms or weapons of any kind will be prohibited. And I highly recommend his work, even though his books are becoming increasingly difficult to get a hold of. And another great writer on this subject, Eustace Mullins, in his book, The World Order, says this, quote, what Rockefeller demands is that we change our institutions of government to encompass all the goals of the world order. The Trilateral Commission proposed a new constitution for the United States. Article 8, Section 12 states, no person shall bear arms or possess lethal weapons except police, members of the armed forces, or those licensed under law, end quote. I also recommend his work highly. But the same thing, it's getting increasingly difficult to find. All right, one last little digression here. What is the importance of the United Nations? And, well, I guess, Eustace Mullins referred to Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was founded by David Rockefeller, who is pictured there on the right. And the United Nations headquarters was established on land donated by David Rockefeller. So he has a huge interest in and influence on what the UN is all about. And this is not directly related to this subject, but I thought they were just two interesting quotes that belong to him that I thought I'd share, just to give a little bit of an idea of what you're dealing with here. And he said this in 1991, quote, we are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government, end quote. And in 1994, when he was addressing the United Nations Business Council, he had this to say, quote, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order," end quote. And the statue or sculpture, or whatever you want to call it, on the bottom left there is right outside of those UN headquarters in New York. So, that gives you a little bit of an idea about what these people are interested in. So I'll just stop that for a second. All right, so what are we seeing there? Okay, we're seeing that, Eustace Mullins, G. Edward Griffin, and Dr. John Coleman are all referring to this idea, this concept of a new world order, a global government. And Ed Griffin says that it is its foundation, its ideological foundation is collectivism. So what would examples of collectivism be? They would be, well, socialism, fascism, communism, communitarianism, all of the political ideologies that end disastrously in every historical account and even current times where they've ever existed. Collectivism is established at the expense of individualism. Okay, so under a collectivist system, you don't have any individual rights, or you do to the extent that they don't come into conflict with the objectives of the group or the priority of the group, or more specifically, the priorities of the leaders of the group. So collectivists aren't interested in your individual rights. They're not interested in private property rights. And they're certainly not interested in an individual, human being or nation's capacity to exercise the principle of self-defense. That is not what they're interested in. In fact, that's what they're interested in destroying, because they're going to have problems establishing their system while those things are still in place. Okay. So, all right, I think that's all I need to say about that. So let's just, I just want to share a few quotes. Well, we'll say this. So if this is true, if what these authors are writing about and what they're trying to warn people about and have been trying to warn people about for a very long time, if we consider that maybe this is accurate, that this is a factual matter, how might these people that we can refer to as globalists, how might they implement this system if they want to disarm individual nations? Do you think they might send in the military and do it by way of force, or do you think they might do it in a more subtle and sophisticated and more psychological approach? Well, let's find out. Here we have Gustave Le Bon and his prolific work, The Crowd, which I highly recommend to anybody who is interested in crowd psychology. And he says this, quote, "The great upheavals which precede changes of civilization seem at first sight determined more especially by political transformation, foreign invasion, or the overthrow of dynasties. But a more attentive study of these events shows that behind their apparent causes, the real cause is generally seen to be a profound modification in the ideas of the peoples. The true historical upheavals are not those which astonish us by their grandeur and violence. The only important changes affect ideas, conceptions, and beliefs. The memorable events of history are the visible effects of the invisible changes of human thought. Okay. So the invisible changes of human thought. Well, what more can we discover about that and how that might tie into or be an important part of politics? Well, Edward Bernays, a name that unfortunately isn't familiar with enough people, but hopefully I could encourage anyone listening to this to learn a little bit about him and the influence that he has had on most people in the West, living in Western culture. So from his book, Propaganda, which was published in 1928, he says, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. Whatever attitude one chooses toward this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." And he also goes on to say in the same book, if we understand the mechanism that motivates, if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. Wow. That's pretty significant. And, you know, do you think that the removal, if these globalists plan to implement a world government, is a fact, and if it is in progress, do you think they would take guns by force, or do you think they might use this other way of fulfilling their objectives by way of psychological manipulation? And just very briefly, we'll touch on who is Edward Bernays? Who is this guy? Well, he's the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Bernays pioneered the scientific technique of shaping and manipulating public opinion. So, which he called the engineering of consent. Among his powerful clients were President Calvin Coolidge, Procter & Gamble, CBS, the American Tobacco Company, and General Electric. So this is legitimate. This is well and truly established fact. If this was all, rubbish, then those companies and those individuals certainly wouldn't be paying to have someone like him advise them on how to go about achieving their objectives. Okay. He was also a very instrumental figure at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which I might touch on in a separate video. So this knowledge is out there. This is tried, and it's down. They've got this down to a fine art, a fine science. Okay. So now, knowing this, I thought I'll just take a brief look at some of the mass shootings that have taken place. Let me just stop there. Okay. So how could we establish that this could possibly be occurring, since we don't see people's firearms being removed by way of force? Could they be being removed in another way? And I just want to say the significance of this, why this is important. People are being told a load of rubbish about guns and gun ownership, and you know, what really is the foundation of this is the principle of self-defense. That's why this is important, okay? Because it's not getting rid of all guns. If it was getting rid of all guns, then, you know, fine, I wouldn't particularly have a problem with that. But that is not what's being proposed. What's being proposed is that all the guns that can be used in the capacity of self-defense are handed over to a global, you know, governmental system that's foundation is established at the expense of your individual rights. Okay, so, you know, and people are like, oh, they're not banning all the guns. Yes, I know they're not banning all the guns, but the guns that you do have and are allowed to have access to, you really cannot use in a capacity, in a self-defense capacity. Okay, especially when someone else has an automatic or semi-automatic weapon. You know, your rifle is in the safe over there, and your ammunition's, you know, in another safe, another part of the house over there, or whatever the case may be. It is not practical for self-defense. It is completely okay for taking out on a hunting expedition, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the principle of self-defense and how it is being undermined and eroded under the auspices of disarmament, and that this is a good thing. It's not a good thing. So let's take a look at some of the mass shootings that have occurred and see if there's a pattern. Because, you know, I think patterns are very telling. Patterns communicate something. Because if you're dealing with truly individual sovereign nations, and they're all experiencing a problem, you'd think, or it would at least be logical to me, that some of them would come up with different solutions. So let's just take a look at some of the events that have taken place so far. The Hungerford Massacre was a spree shooting in the United Kingdom on the 19th of August in 1987, when 27-year-old Michael Ryan shot dead 16 people, including an unarmed police officer and his own mother. Heard that a few times before shooting himself. No firm motive for the killing has ever been established. It's just a mystery, okay? But what isn't a mystery is that the Firearms Amendment Act of 1988 was passed in the wake of the incident, which bans the ownership of semi-automatic rifles and restricts the use of shotguns with the capacity of more than 3 cartridges, okay? So what happens there is that there is a tragedy, and the result of the tragedy is the contraction of individual freedoms, the contraction of individual rights, the contraction of the individual and national capacity for self-defense, and the expansion of state power. Okay. Then we have the Dunblane Massacre, which took place at Dunblane Primary School in Scotland, United Kingdom, on the 13th of March, 1996. So a month before Port Arthur. When Thomas Hamilton shot dead 16 pupils and 1 teacher, injured 15 others before killing himself. It remains the deadliest mass shooting in British history. Following the killings, public debate centered on gun control laws. In response to this debate, 2 new firearms acts were passed, which outlawed the private ownership of most handguns within the United Kingdom. So again, same pattern. Tragedy, individual freedoms contract, state power expands. Then we have the Port Arthur Massacre, which occurred over the 28th and 29th of April in 1996. It was a mass shooting in which 35 people were killed and 23 others were wounded in Port Arthur, Tasmania. The murderer, supposedly Martin Bryant, pleaded guilty and was given 35 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Fundamental changes of gun control laws within Australia followed the incident. The case is the worst massacre in modern Australia committed by a single person. So we can see the same pattern occurring. No one of these countries so far is coming up with an alternative. No one is suggesting that, hey, maybe like we have a military that can respond to an international threat. Why aren't we training our citizens to respond appropriately to a domestic threat? Why not, train people on how to responsibly use guns and make them more accessible to those law-abiding citizens who can safely demonstrate that they can use this tool as a means of protecting themselves, their families, and their community. We're not hearing any of that. We're just hearing guns are bad, disarm the citizens. Most criminals don't obtain their guns illegally anyway. So what difference does that make? It is just making it more difficult for the law-abiding citizen to exercise the principle of self-defense should they need to in that capacity. So again, on the 15th of March, 2019, the Christchurch mosque shootings took place, where 2 consecutive mass shootings occurred on 2 mosques in New Zealand. The attacks carried out by a lone gunman. We're going to hear a lot about that concept. Well, not here, but later. 28-year-old Brenton Tarrant left 51 people dead and 40 injured. So we're told. Gun laws in New Zealand came under scrutiny in the aftermath, specifically the legality of military-style semi-automatic rifles. On the day of the attack, Jacinda Ardern announced that gun laws would change. On the 21st of March, Ardern announced a ban on semi-automatic weapons. The Arms Amendment Act 2019 was introduced in the House of Representatives on the 1st of April and passed its first reading the following day. So we're seeing the same pattern there. Then we have the Nova Scotia attacks on April 18th and 19th of 2020, where Gabrielle Wortman committed multiple shootings and set fires at 16 locations in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, killing 22 people and injuring 3 others before he was shot and killed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. On May 1st, Trudeau announced that the sale, transportation, importation, or use of assault-style firearms in Canada was now banned, effective immediately. Okay. So there's a clear pattern occurring with all these events, right? So we've established that there is a lot of literature and a lot of very sound authors and researchers doing their best to expose this concept of a new world order, of a one world government, and that this system of government will be founded on the principles of collectivism, right? This is not a government that endorses your individual rights, your private property rights, or your ability to defend yourself, okay? And then I've posed the question, how would they go about achieving that? Are they, do you think they're going to do it by force? You think they're going to try and send in, a UN military to take, America's guns by force, or to take Australia's guns by force, or anywhere else for that matter? Of course not. We've touched on the ability, the tried, the tested, the well and truly established ability to manipulate and contrive, regiment and control people's thinking by the types, the Edward Bernays types that exist in this world. And we've touched on the recurring pattern that has occurred. And I just picked 5, right? There's plenty more. There's plenty more you can go and investigate for yourself, and you will see the same pattern. There's obviously a problem in the United States. They have the Second Amendment, and I think they are a lot more switched on to what I'm talking about than the other countries that I mentioned there. You know, they've fallen for it straight away. So I'll round things up with that. I hope this has been interesting. I haven't done a video for a long time, so I've felt like I bumbled my way through this, but I think I made my points. And if you found the content interesting, please give us a like. Please subscribe to the channel. I intend to make a lot more content discussing things such as this, and I will definitely continue with this little mini series, I guess, and we'll take a deep dive into the Port Arthur Massacre in the following video. So thanks heaps for tuning in, and I'll see you guys shortly.